Now, Gary Lineker says he stands by his criticism of the government's new migration bill, or immigration bill, does not fear suspension, he says, by the BBC. This all comes after the backlash following the presenter tweeting earlier this week when he compared the language used to launch the government policy with that used in 1930s Germany. Well, then Culture Secretary Lucy Fraser telling the Commons this morning it was important for the broadcaster to maintain impartiality, to retain the trust of the public who pay the licence fee, and reflecting that her own grandmother had actually escaped Nazi Germany in the 1930s. So she was saying that this was disappointing and inappropriate in terms of the language that he'd used. Well, joining us now, our political reporter Olivia Utley, to bring us up to date, because it seems to be a political argument about the immigration bill itself, and then this issue of free speech as well, with the BBC caught in the middle of it. Yes,
and the BBC is in a very awkward position now, because essentially Gary Lineker is right to say that he doesn't fear suspension with the BBC in a way, because the editorial charter is written as such that freelance presenters such as him aren't actually required to keep the same standards of impartiality as BBC journalists. So whereas, you know, a news reporter would, of course, be sanctioned for making a comment
Robinson,
like that.
Indeed, from Radio 4 saying, you know, I'd be on my way, I'd be out the door.
Exactly. And yet these freelance presenters who work under a contract aren't subject to the same rules. But with Gary Lineker, it puts the BBC in a very awkward position, because although he is actually just a contractor, he is also, in some respects, the face of the BBC.
Yeah, exactly.
He's very closely associated with the BBC. So the BBC obviously now feel as though it should have been clearer in his contract that he shouldn't be able to intervene in very hot political subjects like this. So it'll be really, really interesting to see what they do. And it was said that they were going to have frank words with him. Well, he's sounding pretty defiant this morning, so either those frank words haven't yet been had or they weren't frank enough. But it does leave them in a very awkward position, because he's done this. The Mail's counted 9 times before where he's made similar interventions, very heavily criticising the Conservative government, and he shows no signs of stopping.
Indeed, no. In fact, as you were saying, standing by that criticism, this is what he had to say to reporters a little earlier when he left home.
Do you regret sending the tweet at all?
No. Do you stand by what you said?
Sorry?
Do you stand by what you said in your tweet?
Of course. Right.
Thank you.
So he stands by that criticism, and we've got the whole issue about, you know, should he be commenting on political issues as a sports presenter anyway? Richard Eyre, former controller of editorial policy, the Director General may have to dismiss him, which perhaps is at one sort of side of the argument. Roger Mosier, and former head of or director of sports, saying he has some sympathy with Lineker. So there are, you know, differing views of what should be done. But we then have the Culture Secretary, top of the tree, talking in the Commons, saying about these specific comments where the parallels being drawn with 1930s Nazi Germany, and her family having direct experience of that, saying inappropriate and disappointing.
Yes, so this is the government's line, that it is disappointing, but ultimately it's a matter for the BBC. Both things, it's quite useful for the government, really. The government is very proud of its new immigration policy because it believes that it resonates with the public, and it's probably right to believe that, because the small boats issue is seen as the second most important issue to UK voters who voted Conservative at the last general election. Rishi Sunak also believes that it's a useful way of creating some clear blue water between himself and Keir Starmer, because Keir Starmer, notably when he laid out his 5 pillars, I can't remember exactly, they all use different words, but whatever it was.
Tablets of stone, as you remember from Ed Miliband.
Not tablets of stone, but 5 bullet points, essentially, on what he'd like to do for the country. Very notably, small boats, addressing the small boats problem, immigration at all, wasn't on there. So Rishi Sunak clearly saw that as an opportunity to show that he is the one who's serious about this.
And I'm just looking at the language that was used at PMQs. We are on the side of the people, Rishi Sunak, then the people's priority. So clearly they see this as resonating with a certain section of the public. So could it be that they believe that Gary Lineker is a useful pantomime villain, as is what I put to Nigel Nelson earlier?
I think there's definitely an argument for that, because also, perhaps I'm being too cynical here, but it has distracted a bit over the last day or so from from scrutiny of the actual details of the legislation itself, which in some respects seems a little bit vague. We still don't know.
The boats?
Will it actually stop the boats? We don't know what's going to happen. For example, they've said that people who come to this country illegally will be sent away after 28 days, but obviously, we know that these Rwanda cases keep being held up in the courts. So what exactly will happen after 28 days? It's not clear. And instead of having to address that over the last 24 hours, the government has been in this really quite helpful Gary Lineker distraction, as it were.
Olivia, thank you very much indeed for that.